for the most wild and most homely narrative that I'm about to impart, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it when my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and most assuredly do I not dream. For in the morning I die. Not today. Today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before you all plainly, succinctly, and without evidence, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me, yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little more than a nightmare. Hereafter, perhaps some intellect may be found that will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own will perceive the circumstances that I detail in awe as nothing more than a succession of causes and effects. From my infancy I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great many pets. With these I spent most of my time, and was never so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood became one of my principal sources of pleasure. For those of you that have cherished an affection with a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly explain the nature or the intensity of the gratification one gets. There is something in the unselfish and self-love of a dog that goes straight to the heart, which would question the fleeting friendship of mere man. I married early in life, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. On observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity in obtaining those of a most agreeable kind. We had birds, a fine dog, a small monkey, rabbits, and a cat. This cat was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of its intelligence, my wife often alluded to that popular notion which regards all black cats as witches in disguise. Pluto, for this was the cat's name, was my favourite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our companionship continued in this manner for a number of years, during which time my temperament and character experienced a radical change for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use foul language towards my wife, and at length I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, couldn't help but notice the change in my disposition, as I not only neglected, but ill-used them too. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to prevent me from causing him any harm. But what disease is like alcohol? And at length, even Pluto, who was now becoming old, even Pluto began to feel the ill effects of my temper. One night, as I returned home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about the town, I fancied that the cat avoided me. I seized it, and in its fright at my violence it inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with its teeth. The rage of a demon instantly took hold of me, and I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed to at once take leave of my body. From my waistcoat pocket, I withdrew a pocket penknife, grabbed the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut out one of its eyes from the socket. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's gin, I experienced a sentiment half of disgust and half of remorse for the crime of which I was guilty. But I again plunged myself into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The empty socket of the lost eye, however, gave a frightful appearance, but it no longer seemed to suffer any pain. It went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in absolute terror if I came anywhere near. I was at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature that once so loved me. But these feelings soon gave way to irritation, and then came, as if to be my final overthrow, then came the spirit of perversity. Of this nature philosophy takes no account, yet I am no more sure that my soul lives than I am that perversity is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart. For who, among you, has not 100 times committed a vile or silly action for no other reason than they know they should not? The spirit of perversity, I say, came to be my final overthrow. It urged me to continue and to finally consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the poor beast. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around its head and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming down my face and the bitterest remorse in my heart. Hung it because I knew it had loved me and had caused me no offence. Hung it because in so doing I knew my immortal soul would not be forgiven by a merciful God. On the night of the day in which this wicked deed had been done, I was awoken by shouts of fire. I opened my eyes to find the curtains around my bed in flames. In fact, the whole house was ablaze, and it was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from this living nightmare. The destruction was complete, and my entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall which stood in the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering here had resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to it having been recently spread. About this wall was gathered a dense crowd of people, of which some seemed to be examining a portion of it. Words such as strange, singular, and other such expressions excited my curiosity. I approached the wall and saw an image upon its surface of a gigantic cat. It was remarkably uncanny. It had a rope about its neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my terror and my wonder was extreme. But at length, reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, a large crowd of people were gathered in the garden. Someone had then cut down the animal and thrown it through an empty window into my chamber with the intention of awakening me. Then the falling of other walls would have compressed the victim of my crime into the newly spread plaster. This, with the lime, the flames, and the ammonia from the carcass, presented me with the image as I saw it. But for months I could not rid myself of that phantasm of the cat. There, however, later came into me a loss. I missed the animal and began to look among the vile haunts that I now frequented for another cat in which to replace it. One night, as I sat, half stupefied in a den of ill repute, my attention was drawn to a black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin which constituted the chief furniture of this apartment. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a cat, fully as large as Pluto and resembling him in every aspect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any part of his body, but this cat had a large splotch of white covering nearly the entire region of his breast. Upon my touching it, it immediately got up, purred loudly, and seemed delighted with my affection. This, then, was the cat that I had been looking for. I at once offered to purchase it from the landlord, but he made no claim to it, knew nothing about it, had never seen it before. So I continued to stroke the animal, and when it came time for me to depart for home, it showed an inclination to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, stooping occasionally and patting it as we went along. Upon our arrival at the house, it domesticated itself at once, and immediately became a favourite with my wife. For myself, however, I soon found a dislike to the creature arising within me, but this was the opposite of what I had expected. But its evident fondness of me disgusted me, and at length these feelings of disgust mutated into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, but a certain sense of shame at my former wicked deed prevented me from causing it any harm. But slowly, very slowly, I began to look at it with utter loathing and to silently flee if it came anywhere near. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after that I had brought it home, that like Pluto, it had been deprived of one of its eyes, a fact that only made my wife care for it more. She had that feeling that I once used to have. With my hatred of this beast increasing, its partiality to me seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity that would be difficult for you to comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring up onto my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I stood up to walk again, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or jump up and stick its sharp claws into my chest. Though at such times as these I longed to destroy it with a single blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by the memory of that former wicked deed, but chiefly by an absolute dread of the creature. This dread was not the dread of physical violence, yet I am at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am also ashamed to admit that the terror and fear with which this creature inspired within me had been heightened by my dear wife. You see, she had often called my attention to that mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the chief difference between this beast and the one that I had destroyed. You will also remember me saying that this mark of white hair was originally a large splotch of white, but by reasons which I struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a distinct, vigorous outline. It was now the representation of a hideous thing, a ghastly thing, an image of the gallows. And now I was wretched beyond the wretchedness of all humanity, and neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of sleep any more, and by the former the creature left me no moment alone, and by the latter I woke hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to feel the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight incumbent upon my chest. But beneath the pressure of torments such as these, any remnants of goodness within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my temper increased into a bitter hatred of all things and of all mankind. My uncomplaining wife, however, was the usual and most patient of sufferers. One day, she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steps, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me into madness. I grabbed an axe, forgetting in my anger the childish dread that had hitherto stayed my hand, and aimed a blow at the creature, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But the blow was prevented by my wife. Goaded by her interference into her satanical rage, I removed my arm from her grasp and buried the axe deep into her brain. She fell down dead on the spot. But what struck me as unusual was, in so doing, she made no sound. Not a cry, not a moan, not a sigh came from her lips. It was almost as though she welcomed death. Having achieved this hideous and most evil of murders, I now set myself to the task of concealing the body. I knew I could not remove it from the house neither by day nor by night without running the risk of being observed by neighbours. Many ideas went through my mind. At one point, I thought about chopping the corpse into minute pieces and then destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for the corpse in the floor of the cellar, or to cast it down the well in the yard, or even to box it in a crate as if merchandise and then summon a porter to take it away from the house. Many ideas went through my mind. Finally, I settled upon an expedient far better than any of these. I decided to wall the corpse up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages have been recorded to have done so with their victims. And for this purpose, the cellar was ideally suited. The walls were loosely constructed, and it had recently been plastered throughout with rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening yet. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused either by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled in to resemble the rest of the cellar. I was pretty sure that I could remove the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and rebuild the wall as it had originally stood. And in this calculation I was not deceived. With the aid of a crowbar, I easily removed the bricks and inserted the corpse against the inner wall. I propped it up and then rebuilt the structure as it had originally stood. I then mixed up some new plaster that could not be distinguished from the old, and carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I cleared up any mess, folded my arms across my chest, and said to myself, "Here at least my labour has not been in vain." I now set myself to the new task of locating the creature which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death, and had I been able to locate it at this present moment in time, there could have been no doubt as to its fate. But the crafty animal must have been alarmed at my earlier violence, and had decided not to present itself to me in my present mood. It's hard to describe the deep sense of relief which the absence of the creature caused within me. It did not show itself again that night, and for the first night since its introduction into the house, I soundly slept, even with the burden of murder upon my soul. It did not show itself for the next 2 nights, and once again I breathed as a free man, as it seemed as though the monster in its terror had fled the house forever. I would behold it no more. A search had been instigated, but of course nothing was to be found. I looked upon my future happiness as secure. On the 4th day of the assassination, a party of police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded again to make a thorough investigation of the place. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. In time, the officers descended into the cellar. I quivered, not a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms across my chest and easily went to and fro. In time, the officers were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee in my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say but one word by way of triumph and render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. Gentlemen, I said at last as the party ascended the steps, I am delighted to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all good health and perhaps a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this house is very well constructed. In my rabid desire to say something, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I must say, an excellently well constructed house. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily upon that portion of the wall which behind stood the corpse of my wife. And may God protect me from the fangs of Satan. No sooner had the echo of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb. A cry at first, muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long and continuous scream, utterly inhuman. A howl, a wailing howl, such as might have arisen from the depths of hell conjointly, from the throats of the damned in their agony, and from the demons that exult in their damnation. For one moment, the party upon the steps remained motionless through the extremity of terror and awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It easily fell. The corpse, already clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, red mouth extended and solitary eye of fire, sat the creature whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.